Well, hello everyone. I'm Karen Patterson, and it really is great to be with you once again for this year's St. Patrick Symposium, though sadly not in person. Hats off to Vincent McCann and the team at the wonderful Marketplace Theatre for hosting the event online. The symposium is part of Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council's At Home with St. Patrick's Festival. Details of all other activities as part of the festival are available at visitarmagh.com/St. Patrick. Well, this year's theme is Reminiscence, a story told about a past event remembered by the narrator. St. Patrick penned the Confessio as an old man looking back on his life. Today, we're going to explore what shaped his memories and ask, were they an accurate reflection of events, or did Patrick, like many of us, reform his recollections to suit a particular narrative? Indeed, how does the way we remember the past impact our future? The ongoing pandemic has given us all time for introspection, time to take stock and reflect on what has led to this point in our lives. How would you tell your story? How would you relay the events that shaped your life? It's a fascinating subject, and we have a terrific lineup today. Joining us are Joe Berry, Anthony Toner, Professor Brandon Hamber, Nandi Jolie and Sean Hewitt. Thank you all for being with us today. This is a very informal event, so wherever you are, please feel free to join in. Simply post your questions using the Q&A button at the beginning and end of the event. You don't even have to include your name if you choose not to. You can be anonymous, so feel free to join in. We very much want to hear from you. Sit back and enjoy your time with us over the next couple of hours. But first up this morning, let's hear from the Lord Mayor, Councillor Kevin Savage.
As Lord Mayor of Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's St. Patrick Symposium as part of our At Home with St. Patrick Festival 2021. In March of every year, people across the globe come together to celebrate and commemorate the life and works of Ireland's patron saint, St. Patrick. Often, however, these celebrations can neglect to examine the true impact and importance of St. Patrick within current society. After a year during which so many people have been so severely affected by the coronavirus pandemic, it's important that people have the time, space and facility for personal reflection. After the extremely positive impacts of previous symposia, examining the themes of modern slavery, migration and peacemaking within a modern context, 2021 Symposium will be exploring the theme of reminiscence, its importance in society, its healing power and its restorative capacity. I am delighted that our contributors this morning include Jo Barry and Professor Prof Hamber. Jo has spent much of her life channeling personal tragedy for the betterment of others and for the promotion of peace. Professor Hamber has published multiple works on peace building and has been involved in reconciliation initiatives in South Africa, Liberia, Mozambique, Bosnia and Sierra Leone, amongst others. I welcome both to our virtual conference and look forward to hearing their insights and experiences. I hope that you all find this morning's conference useful, interesting and enlightening, and I look forward to being able to welcome you back to our city in person when circumstances allow. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Thank you indeed. Well, our next guest works to resolve conflict. 16 years after her father was killed in an IRA bomb, Jo Barry met the man responsible, Patrick McGee. This initial meeting led to them sharing a platform together internationally on over 300 occasions. Through her charity, Building Bridges for Peace, Jo demonstrates how empathy can resolve and end conflict. By delivering workshops to young people on conflict transformation, positive change making and challenging violent extremism. Jo is an advocate for restorative justice. Jo, you're very, very welcome this morning.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be here today. And first of all, I just want to send my love to everyone who's experienced trauma and bereavement in the last year. This is such a hard time for many. And I'm going to take you back to 1984, a long time ago, when I was 27. And I woke up on October the 12th to news the bomb had gone off at the hotel that my dad and my stepmother was staying. And my dad was a Conservative MP and he was there as part of the party conference. We had to wait about 8-10 hours to get the news that my father was dead and that my stepmother was injured and that the IRA were responsible. Now, as a teenager, I grew up with the IRA, planting bombs in London, bomb scares, but I lived in peacetime. I was never worried about any of my family. And I realized that living in peacetime is actually quite a privilege, and many in Northern Ireland didn't live in peacetime. I didn't just lose my father in that bomb, whom I adored, but I lost the part of me that felt I lived in peace, that felt the world was there for me to explore and create my dreams, because now I am part of a war. I am part of a violent conflict. I feel it. I can't go back to the person I had been. So 2 days later, I went somewhere in London that meant something to me, St. James's Church, and I made a silent vow. I am going to bring something positive out of this. I'm going to understand those who killed my dad because I don't want an enemy. And every day I'm going to find a way to bring peace out of this violence. Now, I had no idea how to do this. I think my emotional intelligence was very low. And this was before I met anyone who'd been on these kind of journeys. But I trusted that somehow life was going to bring me the experiences. And within a few weeks, I ended up sharing a taxi with a complete stranger. We shared a taxi because there weren't any taxis around. We were both going to a similar place in London. And I could tell from his accent he was from Northern Ireland. So I said to him, this might seem odd, but my dad's just been killed by the IRA and I'm trying to understand. Why would someone join the IRA? Can you help me? And he said, no, that's not odd. My brother, he was in the IRA and he was killed last year by a British soldier. So there we were at that time, representing two different sides. We should have been enemies, we could have been, and yet we spoke a world where peace was possible, where nobody killed, where nobody got killed, And I left that taxi thinking I can build a bridge across a divide. And though no one knew, I knew. And that set me off. And I travelled to Northern Ireland in 85 and 86 and went to Belfast and met people who shared their stories with me. They were very open and kind, and I found that I actually felt I belonged more in Northern Ireland than back in London, where people had moved on. I met people from Sinn Féin. I had letters from people in prison. I even started talking in 85. Gave my first public talk. But I wasn't emotionally prepared for this work, and it was at that time still in the middle of the conflict, so I went home. But I never forgot. I never forgot, because every time a bomb went off and someone was killed from whatever side, I felt it. And my commitment to bring peace was there. And then we had the peace process. Finally, people got together and had a conversation about how the fighting can end. And I remember one day turning on the TV just to watch the news, and there was the one person held responsible, Patrick McGee, coming out of prison, and I had no idea he was coming out that day. And I was shocked, and then I was angry. I was thinking, it's okay for you, you've got the rest of your life back. My dad can't come back. But then I thought, this is for peace. This means less people are going to be killed. And so I welcomed that. And the idea of meeting him grew and grew, and I travelled to Ireland a lot in the year 2000, taking part in programmes in Glencree, programmes in Derry, Londonderry and Belfast, met other victims for the first time who'd been through what I'd been through, shared my story. I raged, I cried in safe places, and it was a very transformative time. It was the first time that I felt I was receiving help. And several times I met people who said they could arrange the meeting with Patrick McGee, and I always said, please do. And 3 times I heard back he didn't want to meet me. And I trusted that it wasn't going to be, it was fine. And there were many others to meet, many others I could build bridges with, and I did. I met many being in the IRA. I met families who'd lost loved ones from Bloody Sunday. I met many people being affected by the conflict, and that was all part of my healing. And then one day I got the news I could meet Patrick McGee that evening. I was on my way to Glencree and about to get the ferry to go to Dublin. And I remember thinking, I can't meet Patrick today. I'm not in the mood. I'm not feeling visionary, just thinking of my little girls. But then I thought meeting Patrick McGee was always going to be a huge challenge. And I said to my friend Anne Gallagher, I would be there that evening. And there I am on the ferry, terrified. There's no one there to support me. I do restorative justice and I'm a facilitator. This broke every single rule. And yet there was part of me that knew I needed to meet him for my own healing, not to change him, not to judge him, but to see him as a human being. And that would help humanize something in me. And there I am in my friend's kitchen, no prepared environment, people coming and going. And I am terrified. All these years of not wanting to blame him, how would I feel? And then he walked in the door and I shook hands and thanked him for coming. And he said, no, thank you for inviting me. And we started talking about how every time he was asked, he said yes, but I was hearing no. And I can understand it was about protecting either of us. It was such an early time in the peace process. And we sat down, and that first meeting was 3 hours. I remember the first hour and a half, some strange thoughts in my head. What am I doing here with the man who killed my father? I should go now. But I stayed and I listened some more. And he started off by giving me a political justification, using the word we a lot. And I was prepared for that. I knew that he would. And I could see how much he cared for his community. And the moment I saw how much he cared, I saw him as a human being. He was no longer the faceless enemy, no longer the most demonized terrorist we had at that time. He was a human being. And that helped me. So I was about to leave because it was hard to hear him justifying killing my father. I still miss my father now. And I can never see it as a strategy. I am always passionate about non-violence. But it was important for me to understand why someone should choose violence. And I was about to leave, and then he stopped talking and he said, Jo, I don't know anymore what to say. I don't know who I am. Can I hear your anger and your pain, and what can I do for you? And I knew in that moment that a new journey had started, and he'd moved from justifying to now opening up and becoming vulnerable. And later on, he would say that at moments he was disarmed by my empathy. If I'd gone in there shouting and raging, going, I'm right, you're wrong, he would have stayed in a very safe place of justification. And now he's asking questions about my dad, wanting to know the kind of man he'd been. And I realized that he was now seeing my dad as a human being. And that when he planted that bomb, he saw no one there. That is the nature of violent conflict. And that he was guilty of demonizing the other in the same way he accused the other of demonizing him. Another hour and a half, and I'd finished my ability to listen. And I thanked him. And he said, I'm really sorry I killed your dad. Now, I didn't go for an apology, because no apology would bring my dad back. But what I received from that was him now seeing my dad as someone special and lovely who he had killed. And after that meeting, it was clearly not finished for either of us. We'd started a new journey together. What had just been my need now became his need. And so we met again. In that first year, we met many times, and then became public with a documentary, which came out a year later. And since then, we've met. We've lost count, over 300 times. We've traveled together to Palestine, Israel, Rwanda, Lebanon, all around Europe. We've spoken in Northern Ireland. We had a little riot once when we spoke. I don't think anyone's ever going to forget about that. And every time we speak, we don't rehearse it. We're there to share our story. And sometimes it's hugely challenging. And sometimes it's very moving. And we respond to questions. And so I founded my charity in 2008 to support making sure everyone has alternatives to using violence to resolve their conflict, because I know the cost of one person being hurt in conflict is too great. And now my vision is greater than the work I've done with Patrick, because for me, it is the world. It's how can we bring healing and resolve conflict in the world. And I'm working a lot now online with schools in Tower Hamlets, especially with young women who come from the Muslim community, who receive racist attacks, who are demonized, who are judged every day. And as a white person, I feel hugely responsible to listen and say, I care. Please tell me your story. Please tell me how you've been impacted. And I see that the pain and demonization just is carrying on. And I sense that the amount of trauma that everyone is feeling, especially after last year, is so great. But some of the most meaningful work I've done is not on the big stages doing keynote conferences around the world, but it is with those young women in Tower Hamlets, who I see all as positive change makers. And that's where my work is taking me today, is to empower young people to be positive change makers. I've learned so much from this journey. It's not about changing anyone else but myself. When I look back to the young woman I've been and who I am now, I have gained in so many ways. And I dedicate every day to making sure I don't have an other. And recently I've been having to look at that all over again with what's happening in London the last few days. And I know that our other is just someone whose story we haven't heard. An enemy is someone we've not yet met. And I still have that part of me that wants to blame, wants to make someone wrong and me right. There's satisfaction there, but I see that as a kind of violence. So how can I change the part of me that wants to blame, make you wrong, to actually be able to build empathy and understand? Because I remember sitting down in Derry, London Derry, at a conference, amazing conference, and there were 3 men sitting at a table. One was an ex-British soldier, one was would have been Patrick McGee, and one was an ex-Loyalist combatant, and hearing all their stories and seeing that actually, if I'd lived their lives, I could have been either of them. I could have been their sister, I could have been their mother. And at that moment, there is nothing to forgive. There is just that empathy and understanding, and also no sides. And I think we can go beyond sides, but how do we go beyond sides? How do we go where there is no other? And that, I think, is about healing our own trauma and getting a lot of support and knowing it is possible as well. And that's hard emotional work. But that's where I've dedicated my life to, is to showing there's always going to be another way. It's so easy to demonize people, but the impact of that can lead to violent conflict, as many people know today. And I believe empathy is the key, is the tool. I call it unbounded empathy, because sometimes people say empathy can be used to not empathize with some people. Because I believe when we have empathy for everyone, we're going to want for them the same we want for our community. We're going to want for them the same needs, for them to be happy, to practice their religion, to be safe. So how can we begin to have empathy with everyone? And maybe that's through our politicians, as well as all the grassroots organizations bringing people together. I've taken part in so many groups of people who've seen each other as their other, and then they hear their stories. And there are many people doing this work around the world. So I'm going to leave with the words that whatever anyone is feeling right now is understandable. And there's always going to be a way that we can transform our pain. I believe the amount that I've been hurt is now my ability to feel compassion and to care. And I do care. People say, Jo, surely you've got closure now. You can go back to being a normal person, whatever that is. And I go, no. Because as long as people are struggling, are feeling pain, as long as there's trauma, as long as people are being demonized, I'm going to speak out. I'm going to call out hatred. I'm going to call out racism. I'm going to call out anything that separates us. Because I believe that we can all together create a world where there is safety, where there is justice, and where everyone has a right to well-being and live the life of their dreams. Thank you.
Jo, what a pleasure to meet you and to hear your story. It's incredibly powerful, and I would suggest exceptional. Do you see yourself as an exceptional person to have been hurt in the way that you have been hurt and to turn that pain into something positive?
No, not at all. I feel very normal. And the experience I've had is, in a way, it's been very selfish. I feel better. You know, last week when I was with my girls in Tower Hamlets, and they chose to make resilient boxes to go around the school and little note kindness they were going to write all around. And that makes me feel really happy. So in a way, I'm quite selfish, because this is how I feel better. This is my therapy. And we all have the potential, with support, to transform what's happened to us. So, no.
Where did your support come from, though? You seem to have taken this on a very personal level. A lot of it, it seems, influenced by a chance meeting with someone from this part of the world in a taxi.
Over the years, I've been fortunate to meet so many people, you know, support when I went to Northern Ireland in 85 and 86. You know, recently I know so many people who give me support. And I have days when it all gets too much, you know, when it's overwhelming, the pain and suffering in the world. And then I have my sort of peace heroes, people around the world who, in such difficult circumstances, always show up as being the amazing, compassionate people they are. And that gives me hope. And also when I'm feeling low, then I find a way to give to someone else, because that also helps me.
You said in the early days, in your early visits, particularly to Northern Ireland in around 2000, that you raged and cried in safe places. What did you mean by that?
Well, at Glencree Reconciliation Centre, we had a programme there. And it was the first programme that really involved people from England who'd been affected, because in England, we're all around the country. We don't know each other. And we were invited. And there was a sort of it's like a storytelling, and based on, Michael Lapsley from South Africa has an amazing way of doing storytelling. And it's a safe way where everybody has a chance to tell their story. And everyone deserves to have their story heard. I know there are many people in Northern Ireland who've yet to share their story, and everyone deserves that. And with the safety is about no one saying to you, well, surely you've let go by now, or have you thought of doing this? Safety is when people are allowed to share with unconditional positive regard and acceptance and listening. It's like being witnessed. And there were times when I did feel a rage. I remember the rage of, how dare anyone feel their need to be heard is so important? They killed my dad. And I raged about that, and I cried, and it just felt like every time I expressed the emotions, part of the wound was being dissolved and being healed. And that was with other people. And I only had my first trauma therapy 2 years ago, which was a long time waiting.
Why
And
did you need it 2 years ago?
because there were still some parts of the wound that I was holding on to, and I'd been reading a lot about trauma staying in the body, and I was aware that I still had some trauma. And then I made some choices also a few months afterwards, which has led to other trauma. And that's the thing with dealing with the kind of pain that many of us have gone through, is that secondary things can happen.
What do you mean by that? If you don't mind sharing that with us, how did dealing with that initial pain and trauma bring further trauma into your life?
Well, we were offered no help at the time, which probably won't surprise you, because I work now in an amazing organisation called Survivors Against Terror, and we're trying to get support for victims in England and Scotland and Wales with unfortunately, all the recent terrorist attacks. But we had nothing, and therefore I wasn't able to look after myself because I didn't understand what was happening to me. I had serious traumatic responses and didn't know how to handle it. So I made some choices. I'm just going to say, even in terms of my husband, which led to some trauma. So.
All right, I understand. Quick final point, because I know you're going to stay with us, and there is an opportunity for lots more questions to everyone who joins us this morning a little bit later. So don't forget, if you're joining us, the Q&A button, just get in touch, get your questions through. I'll be able to keep them and put them to all of our relevant guests, either live, as we're doing now with Joe, or a wee bit later in the session. But just finally, on this point, clearly you spent a lot of time with Patrick Magee. You understood his passion for his community and his justification for what he did. Are you in a position to forgive him for what he did?
Well, what is forgiveness? It's such a hard word to use, so I try not to use it. I think it puts pressure on victims before they're ready. For me, it's more about beyond forgiveness. So I've changed the story. He's still the man who planted that bomb, which killed my dad, and I'm never going to forget that. But he's also the man who's traveled with me to different parts of the world, who's given me support at times when I needed it, and who cares about me. And so the story has changed. And I do understand, not all the time, but I mostly understand. I have that empathy for him as to what made him decide to join the IRA. And we're always going to have a huge disagreement about, does violence work? Because for me, it never works. But if we're going to create a peaceful world, which is my dream and my passion, then we need to understand. So what intervention could have happened? That's always my question. What could we have done to stop young men joining the IRA? And it's
Did he
not.
ever tell you that he regretted doing what he did?
He's put it in some words, which makes me know that he struggles deeply, and that before he met me, he didn't really have any problems. He felt he had righteousness on his side, but now he knows he killed a wonderful human being, and that sits very heavily in him. And that's his journey, and it's not an easy journey. And I would say he moves from being very, very sure about what he did to being very unsure. And that's his journey that he's on.
Joe, we have a question in for you from Tony Kennedy. He says, hi, Joe. Have you had any hostile responses during your sessions with Patrick Magee? And if so, how did you deal with it?
Well, I've always said I've never done this work to be liked, which is just as well. I've had all sorts, and the thing is, the way I see it, I'm going to refuse to argue with anyone, because we're all doing our best given the experiences we've had. And I can just as well empathize with someone who finds what I've done very challenging, who's wanting to go for revenge. I understand that. I have that need for revenge as well. What I'm saying is, let's try something different, because revenge doesn't seem to have worked in the world. If we all go for revenge, then, as Gandhi said, an eye for an eye and the whole world goes blind, and we'll just carry on. So for me, this is an experiment. But if people are feeling that what I've done is wrong and that I should have gone for revenge, I really listen And there are times when, sometimes the radio, they like to interview me and then someone has got a diametrically opposite view, expecting me to argue. And if someone says that they think what I've done is really, really wrong and they wouldn't do it, then I know they've got their own story. And I'll say, this is really hard for you. Has something happened in your life? And once they start sharing their story, we're no longer in a situation where one's right, one's wrong, because we all have our stories.
And just finally, at this point, Jo, have you siblings? As a family, we're talking about reminiscence today and how people remember things in different ways. Even within your family, are you all agreed with the position you've taken and the decision to reach out to Patrick Magee, or is there differences there?
Oh, there's huge differences, which is what you'd expect. I have 5 siblings. And there's lots of the next generation as well. And they have different feelings and thoughts. I have 3 daughters and 2 of them are older than I was when the bomb went off. And they're very much feeling the difficulty that I had when I was 27. And they never met their lovely granddad. They feel it strongly. So there's space for all of us to have our thoughts and our feelings. And there is one of the younger generation who's actually in touch with me about, he wants to do his own research and he's doing his own project. But we all have space to be who we are. And the loss is there. We all feel the loss. And how come, I've been thinking that very soon people who knew my dad really well won't be with us. I'm looking about how we can get some of those stories about him so we can keep them in a way as pass it on to the next generation.
Final question at this point. There's another question in for you, Jo. And as I say, keep these questions coming because we can return to Jo a little bit later. Sarah Welsh has been in touch. She says, I work with young people in peer mediation aged between 10 and 16. I'm interested in the work Jo Berry is doing with young people. What is a resilience box? I'm doing a positive conversation workshop online at the moment. And she said these conversation workshops are to deal with issues linked to COVID restrictions and issues related to friendships and relationships. Jo.
Lovely question and fantastic work that you're doing. So these girls, they created their resilience box. So they hadn't even known what resilience was till we started talking and working together. And they decided they want to help others build resilience. So this box is, they're going to write a whole lot of thoughts to help themselves be resilient. And then when they're struggling, they can go and take one of them and remember. And it was their idea, and to have them in every classroom and in their schools, they've got a very complicated way of how they're all going to be. So it's a way of helping each other build resilience and remember when they're all feeling low, and there are ways to help themselves up. So it's through messages of resilience, messages of hope, messages of kindness.
Lovely response, Jo. Thank you very, very much indeed. And as I say, anybody else with any questions, how could you not have for Jo? What an incredible story she has. Do please get in touch. Just press the Q&A button. You can do so anonymously if you choose to. All interaction is brilliant, really, at this time. So let's pause for a moment or two, shall we, and enjoy some music with Anthony Toner. Anthony, if you haven't come across him before, great fella. He's famed for his accomplished guitar playing and easygoing banter. He's one of Northern Ireland's most popular live acts, chalking up dozens of live shows a year. That's a normal year. This is anything but normal, Anthony, as a solo acoustic artist. So what have you got for us this morning, Anthony?
Well, on the theme of reminiscence, vast quantities of my material are based on reminiscence. And I think in doing that and in trying to put it into words and music, it's a way for me to kind of make sense of our lives and to make sense of the past. So I've got a couple of songs. One of them came out of my family tradition. I was the child of a mixed marriage. My father was a Catholic and my mother was Presbyterian, and she converted to Catholicism, or as they say up in Coleraine, she turned with him. She turned with him, you know. So anyway, so I grew up in this kind of situation where I had, people on one side of the family who were taking part in civil rights marches, and people on the other side of the family who were in the B specials beating up the people who were taking, it was very strange upbringing. And this song kind of came out of thinking about some of my older uncles on my mother's side of the family, who were in the Orange Order, which was a very mysterious kind of thing for me. I didn't understand what that was, but yet I would go with my mother down to the Bushmills Road on the 12th and wave at my uncles, you know, as they went past. And I had this kind of vision of one of those guys on his own kind of deathbed, thinking back on his own life. So this is called Last Go Round. Caught my eye on Queen Street, and I thought this town was worth a damn. I lifted up my load, and on Friday took my pay. That was my generation, still in memory of the war, knowing what the sacrifice was for. And it made me strong till old age came creeping on. Now on my last go round, now all the long lost daughters and their kids all come around to see the old man slipping before they put him in the ground. I work my nights and days to get them out into the world. Now here they are home again. I suppose they thought I probably wouldn't mind. Now on my last go round. When I left school, I was only 14. I hit the night shift straight away. I thought I'd never see the daylight again, my love. And now you mock my brow, and you hold my shaking hands. The 12th goes by my door, and I don't even see the bands. My marching days are over. Put my shoes under the bed. Take me to Queen Street instead. When your hand was in mine and the colors they were fine. Now on my last go round.
Lovely.
I'll say thank you. I'm imagining wild applause out there in
I can do that for you.
and I've another song for you, and this one's quite interesting. This is the song that I'm kind of most known for, thanks mostly to the late, very great and very much missed Jerry Anderson, who played this song an awful lot on his radio show, and really kind of got me out into the world playing my own material. And it was a song inspired by Reminiscence. It was inspired by the poetry of John Campbell, who wrote very movingly about Sailortown and about York Street. and that neighborhood and the characters who live down there. So it kind of, the song came out of Reminiscence. It was supposed to be a depiction of a contemporary teenage romance that was on the skids, basically. And it's very interesting for me. This week, by coincidence, on Wednesday, I'm taking part in an online concert from St. Joseph's in Sailortown, a kind of an all-day St. Patrick's Day thing. And they're working down there. There's a regeneration trust that's kind of refurbishing St. Joseph's and trying to make it into a community center and a drop-in center and a place for activities and concerts and all kinds of stuff. And they're very conscious of the fact that Reminiscence is a major part of what they're doing, but it's not all. You know, the Reminiscence is feeding into the present and is hopefully feeding into the future. So, you know, the theme of Reminiscence is kind of all around us, and in this particular part of the world, we have to find a way of harnessing the positive parts of that rather than the dark parts. So on that rather preachy little note, I will leave you with this song, and I'll dedicate this to the late Jerry Anderson and to Vinny, who apparently likes this song a lot. So this is Sailortown.
Oh, he does.
Me and Elaine, we've been hanging around in what was once Sailortown, drinking cheap red wine by the light of the Belfast moon. There's nobody left here that works at the docks. It's all urban renewal and apartment blocks. Summer is fading, but winter will be coming soon. The walls in the city have a lot to say about the UVF and the IRA. It's cold by the river, but the sky is full of stars. But these walls say nothing about who I am when I'm singing in the garden at the Rotterdam, doing Brown-Eyed Girl and whiskey in the jar. And I know they're tearing it down street by street. Look out below, there goes the ground beneath your feet. Elaine's mother thinks I'm some kind of crook. She meets me at the door with a dirty look. My welcome round there's starting to wear thin. 'Cause I promised everybody I would knuckle down, but my grades weren't good enough this time round. All my time runs out in the end. And I know they're tearing it down street by street. Look out below, there goes the ground beneath your feet. Me, I can't wait to be rid of school, but Elaine's got a place at Liverpool. By the time September comes, she'll be gone. And she says she'll text me every day, but that's something she feels she has to say. She'll call me once at Christmas and then move on. Me and Elaine, we've been hanging around in what was once Sailortown.
Yay! And the crowd went wild. Anthony, I suppose that's what you've been reminiscing about, live audiences.
Yeah, it's very, very strange. I mean, for people in my line of work, we get a tremendous sense of validation from going out and playing and getting an interaction from an audience. And while you can share stuff online and, you know, on Facebook and all these kind of things, it's obviously not quite the same. But it's okay. I've had a lot of work to be getting on with in terms of working on new material and things like that. So I still feel a sense of forward motion. I miss the sociability of it really, really badly,
Yeah.
as everybody does.
So has it been quite a creative period, that time for a wee bit of introspection and thinking what you want to do next?
Well, the first lockdown, I immediately thought this is a golden opportunity for me to go upstairs with a sheet of paper and get work done at last and finish things off. And for some reason, the first lockdown was totally unproductive. I couldn't get anything finished. Um, and all of the usual techniques that I used, they all seemed to fail. Um, and I don't think it's a coincidence. My father passed away in July of last year after a long battle with dementia. Um, and I think at that point, just after that, the floodgates opened. Again, probably reminiscence, certainly the emotional upheaval of that. But I'm delighted to say that, well, delighted is probably not the wrong word to use and not the right word to use, but since then the floodgates have remained open and I've had a host of new material. I'm very, very grateful for that. So although I miss terribly working with other musicians and doing gigs and so on, I'm coming up here in the morning and getting started and things are actually happening.
Does your dad feature in some of your new material then, do you think?
Very much. Well, he's featured a lot through material. I wrote a song called An Alphabet about my father's Alzheimer's condition. We were inspired by that condition. So he's a constant through line. He was a terrific storyteller and a very fun-loving, very sociable man. I just loved the crack and the company. And certainly this new collection of material is looking back on him and on my late mother who passed away about 6 years ago.
Oh.
So yeah, it's looking back a lot on childhood and things like that. And thankfully not in a rueful way, and in a very, in some cases, I hope quite funny way.
Comedic.
Yeah, well, I mean,
families, isn't it? And I think we're all at this time, putting so much more focus on those closest to us and
Yeah.
relationships that perhaps have been fractured and trying to repair them or whatever it might be. I was curious though when you talked about, the differences within your family, like so many families in Northern Ireland, whether it was, the uncle in the orange order or the priest on your father's side or whatever it might have been. What was a family get together like? Was it strained, or did they actually all get on like a house on fire?
It was interesting because my father mixed a lot with my mother's family, and they loved him, again, because his tradition didn't really come into it. His personality came into it, and he was always teasing people, and he was full of crack and all that kind of thing. My mother didn't mix that much with my father's side of the family, and I'm not really sure why that was. I never had a sense growing up. I never had a sense that there were certain cousins who I didn't mix with and certain cousins that I did. I seemed to be kind of open to them all. And no doubt, I mean, I was a kid, but no doubt there were probably tensions within that, or people who kind of, looked askance at it or whatever. But I think it was, I mean, growing up in Coleraine in the late 60s, as well, I was born 65, but I imagine that my parents probably as a kind of a mixed marriage couple probably would have made them keep their heads down and be careful about what bars they would have gone to and stuff like that. But that's the same in every town, I think.
Yeah. Every town, as you say, has its own kind of complexion. But whenever you're now looking at your new material, what are you going to hit us with first?
From the new material,
Yeah.
I've got are you asking me to do another song? No,
Oh,
I don't
have
think we
we
have
got
time.
time? I think we've got time. Wait, let me see. What time are we on? We've got da, la, la. Yeah, go on, hit it. You're so good.
Do I have
Give us a
another
little
one?
flavor of something new.
I would need to get another guitar, Karen. There's another
All right.
guitar downstairs.
All
Sorry.
right. Well, maybe
Sorry.
next time. Well, not to worry. But give
Yeah.
us an idea of what kind of material it is. So it's reminiscing about. Have you a particular track that you're thinking of?
Well, there's one that springs to mind that I was working on the other day. There's a song. These things that come back to you in memory. I had a sudden memory that for about 4 or 5 years, my mother had on the bedroom wall had a life-size poster of Elvis Presley.
Oh.
which is a very strange thing for a woman her age to have on a bedroom wall, you know? And I remember thinking, it came into my head a while back, and I thought, what was that doing there? And then I think I reasoned about it, and I thought, well, maybe some niece or nephew had given it to her as
Yeah,
a birthday present, and she felt that she had to display it.
yeah.
So this song kind of came out of all of that.
Ah.
I got some great lines. I was very proud of some of the lines for describing him as he was. The line was, he was large as life in a turquoise jumpsuit and aviator shades, a Vegas Tutankhamun before the shine began to fade.
Excellent.
But it's kind of a monologue about that, and then I also put myself in the position of my father. You know, I wondered how he must have felt to wake up in Harper's Hill and find Elvis looking down every morning. But also, it ends with the idea of us sleeping all night under the protection of the king.
Well, hey, no
So
better memory.
I'm working on that, and I played the little kind of demo version of it I had. I played it to my wife Andrea the other day, and she went, "This is so good. You've got to get this one finished." So I'm very excited about that one.
Oh, well, listen,
You'll be the first to hear, Karen.
I would love to. It's genuinely been such a pleasure to get to know you a little bit over the last couple of days. So thank you, Anthony. Great. And as I say, fed in so beautifully into what we're trying to achieve today, which is fond memories and, you know, where they launch pad for the next phase, eh?
Yeah, of course. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much, Karen. It's lovely to be part of this as well.
Yeah, it's a great initiative, isn't it? Anthony, thank you very much indeed. I know you can't join us for the roundup at the end. You've got another engagement, but hey, we very much value your time for now. So thank you very much, and good luck with the new album whenever it comes out.
Thanks, Karen.
Take care, Anthony. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so next we are pleased to welcome today Professor Brandon Hamber. Brandon is the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair in Peace at Ulster University, and he's based at the International Conflict Research Institute. He trained as a clinical psychologist in South Africa and has participated in various peace and reconciliation initiatives in Northern Ireland, South Africa, Liberia, Mozambique, Bosnia, Colombia, the Basque Country, and even Sierra Leone. So if you are with us, can I see you on screen? Yes, I can indeed. Professor Brandon Hamber, you're very, very welcome today. It's been a fascinating conversation so far. So please tell us what your experience has been to date in dealing with reminiscence and storytelling and the role it has for a broken society.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. I presume you can see the little PowerPoint there. Is that okay, Karen?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Great. Well, look, thanks. Thank you, as I said, for inviting me to be here. It's slightly daunting for me in the sense that I wouldn't consider myself an expert on St. Patrick or on John Hewitt. But I do focus on international conflict. And what I thought I might do today is maybe in a slightly different tone to some of what we've heard before, but to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of remembering and what I have learned working in different conflicts around the world. I'm not going to give a technical talk about, how the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission worked or what are some of the challenges in Northern Ireland around those processes. Maybe we can keep that for the question and answer time, but I thought I would rather just sort of raise a couple of points, some of the challenges, some of the difficulties with remembering when it comes to issues of conflict. But before doing that, I wanted to maybe start in a more positive place, because I think when I talk about conflict, we often end up getting into some of the more challenging and difficult issues of what's going on in the globe. But it is important to acknowledge that actually we've made significant achievements in terms of peace and conflict issues over the years. Interstate conflict, for example, and interstate war has been declining over the years. Many people in the world, not everyone, of course, are living much longer, healthier lives than ever before in the history of humanity. And I think that is important. We've set up many global structures like the International Criminal Court. We've seen people demanding their rights much more, whether it's in Black Lives Matter through to Hong Kong or the Arab Spring. So there's actually much to be positive about. And of course, if we think of the conflict in Northern Ireland, significant achievements if you think of the number of deaths of people in the conflict compared to what it is today, despite all of its challenges. The little picture I put up there is actually of my son. He was invited to an event at the Maze Longkesh. That's a good number of years ago, where they brought together school children from different schools to celebrate and think about peace. And I put that there as a way of recognizing those positive changes, because when I told him that when I was at school, I used to be caned if I didn't do something correctly or crossed some boundary, he actually thought I was making that up. He didn't think it was true, because he grew up in an environment where actually the idea of a teacher beating a child is just beyond comprehension. So the story is that attitudes can change. And so whatever I say now, in terms of some of the more negative stuff, I wanted to caveat that with that actually attitudes do change. And even in Northern Ireland, although not perfectly, statistics show that attitudes between communities are improving, albeit much more gradually than what we may like. At the same time, what we know is that global conflict is a massive challenge. And although interstate wars have been decreasing, measures like the Global Peace Index of peacefulness basically suggesting since 2008, actually peacefulness has been declining. And the economic impact of that amounts to something like 14 or 15 trillion dollars. And nearly 2/3 of the world's children actually live in conflict-ridden parts of the world. 426 million children live within 50 miles of a conflict in 2019. So we have significant challenges, and we also know some of the challenges of technology, whether that's sort of lethal autonomous weapons like drones and so on and so forth. And equally, what we know about Northern Ireland is, although there have been many successes in the peace process, it remains a deeply divided society. And also questions of poverty remain a very serious issue. The recent figures in Northern Ireland show that 19% of people in Northern Ireland live in relative income poverty and 16% live in absolute poverty. That's over 300,000 people. And so, we would often characterize the Northern Ireland conflict as a negative peace. So although the conflict has declined, violence has declined, a lot of the underlying issues remain, and we're all very much aware of the cultural wars. In a recent piece of research I did, a police person commenting to me, history is taught from murals and families and not by schools. And we all know those sorts of challenges. So I wanted to just give that as a little bit of a background, and now just raise 4 challenges when we think about remembering and things that I have learned over the years. And the first of these is that we need to find a reflective way of looking at the past. And many of you might not know what this photograph is here, but it's of a museum called the Sarajevo Tunnel Museum. And I went to visit it a number of years ago. It's where during the siege of Bosnia 1992 to 96, a tunnel was built that basically about 4,000 people a day used to smuggle food and military equipment and medicine during the Serb bombardment of Sarajevo. And it was built inside an ordinary house. So you can see there the museum is a house, and you can go into it and you can walk a little bit of the tunnel. And why I'm telling you this is it was the first time I started to think about, is there a sort of a nostalgia of conflict? Of course, nobody wants to go back to exactly the horrible days of the past. But there is also a way that we talk about conflict. And if you go to this museum, people talk about the way the community came together, the way this museum, the tunnel really assisted the wider society, and that there was a sense of comradeship, all of which is true, but also creates a certain type of way of thinking about the conflict. And I've heard that in Northern Ireland in my own research, many people saying, oh, back in the 60s, things were fine. And then everything sort of went wrong and I got on with my neighbors. Now, I don't really know if that's all true or not true, but it did start me to think a little bit about how does this idea of nostalgia in the past, when you've lived through a conflict, actually manifest itself. And there's a writer called Svetlana Bloim, and she writes about 2 types of nostalgia, and I wanted to just introduce them into the conversation today. And the first she calls a restorative form of nostalgia. And this is where we sort of long for the sort of forgotten past, what others have called, history without guilt, where we long to go back to the way things were. And many are critical of this because they would say it's a sort of way, she writes in her work, an abyss of forgetting, that we sort of pretend there was this miraculous, lovely, wonderful past, and we long to go back to tradition, to this traditional way of being. And she says, actually, maybe what we really need is more of a reflective nostalgia. And that is a nostalgia that dwells on the ambivalence of human longing and belonging. And of course, that we can't ever really go back and recreate things the way that they were. So actually, remembering is much more a process of contradiction and critical thinking than it is about trying to restore something that we think was there or that we can ever think was there. And I think that this is particularly true for societies in conflict. So that was the first idea I wanted to introduce. The second idea is, how do we tell our stories in conflict from below? This is, I was going to say my home city, but now I sort of have 2 or 3 homes in both in Northern Ireland and in South Africa. But this is where I grew up. This is Johannesburg. And you can tell the story of Johannesburg from the top. You could tell the story of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. You can tell the story of Johannesburg, where 7% of the wealthiest people hold 40% of the wealth, where 40% of people in that city are poor. We've heard many of the stories of violence, the massive inequality. But you can also tell that story from a very different place, where you can tell the story from those who are selling their wares on the street, for example. And we did a lot of research with a colleague, Ingrid Palmery, in South Africa, where we looked at sort of forgotten communities, whether they were exiles from Zimbabwe living in South Africa or people living in what were called dark buildings without any electricity or any running water. And somewhere those type of stories get lost in the bigger stories. And I wanted to really just raise that point, because when we're thinking about conflict, how do we remember it from below? And often when I hear people talk about the Northern Ireland peace process, they tell that story from the top. The politicians at the table, generally men as well, and they tell that story as if it's a sort of macro story of peace, rather than how does that build from the bottom up. And I'm always reminded of the words of John Paul Lederach, the well-known peace builder. He says the greatest resource for sustaining peace in the long term is always rooted in local people and their culture. And my discipline of peace studies is very much guilty of often telling the story, the macro story, rather than the micro story. So I think it's important, if we're going to engage in thinking about how we talk and remember about conflict, that we think about that. The third is, how do we tell, and it's linked to what I just said as well, but how do we tell the story of the micro and not the macro? And this is maybe a similar point to what I was saying, but if we think of the peace walls are very much in Belfast, the way in which the story of separation in Belfast is often told. And in the last number of years, myself and David Coyles from the School of Architecture and Adrian Grant have been working on a project looking at the hidden barriers of Belfast, where shopping centres or car parks have been built to divide communities. Or if you look at that picture on the left, when you go up in the cherry picker, you see that house, which is basically out of place because it was put there to physically divide communities, or where a road is built to divide communities, or the picture in the bottom right, where actually there are demarcations we can't even see. But when you interview young people, they would say, I will never go over that traffic island, because that's where others from the other side actually exist. So we could again tell the story, and we do that very much from the sort of peace wall perspective, from the grand division, but how do we engage in speaking about these micro forms of division, or what it means to live in what some, when we did interviews for this project, talked about as sort of living in rabbit warren type of communities. The fourth area that I wanted to mention, and to bring it back a little bit to South Africa, is how do we remember in a complex way? And Hopefully in questions we can talk a little bit about my experience of working with people who testified before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that had many successes, but it also created different types of challenges. So for example, the majority of people who spoke before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa were women, which on the surface looks very positive, but actually when you dig down into their stories, what you realize is they were very often telling the story of men. They were telling the story of their husbands or their sons who were killed. They were not telling the story of what it was like to have to bring the rest of the family up without a loved one there, or the time the house was raided and where they in fact had suffered in different types of ways. And so we ended up with a little bit of what some might call a violation-centric way of thinking about conflict. So it's about the murder and the attempted murder, the abduction, the disappearance. It's not about what does it mean to actually live with that experience of conflict. So one of the challenges in remembering conflict is that we tend to focus on the violation and not on the stories. The other challenge that comes with that is that we tend to wrap that up very much in a very clear distinction between the political and ordinary life. So the way people came forward to the Truth Commission, we would think about them as being victims of different political groups or political parties. But actually, those same women that I mentioned, they were really there because they were Black and they were poor and they were marginalized, not simply because they were victims of a political state. So how do we get to that more complex form of storytelling? And the final point, again, and there are successes of the Commission, I'm just talking here about some of the challenges, but how do we get away from a very narrow way of thinking about the value of storytelling? And what you see in the middle there is a poster from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where it was advertising a hearing, and it had this line which said, "Revealing is healing." Now, on one level, that is true, but on another level, it's completely not true at all. It depends on what we reveal, who we reveal it to, when we reveal it, the context in which that takes place, what happens before, what happens after. And when listening to Joe Berry again this morning, you're just reminded of how long that journey is. And so we need to move away from, at the want of a better way of putting it, the sort of McDonald's version of truth telling, which is it's sort of the same everywhere you go. As long as people are telling their story, something good is happening. Well, that may well be true, but it's also very contextual. And what we know in South Africa now is that there are many who would look back at the Truth Commission very negatively. And that's partly because their lives have not changed. And some of that inequality has remained in place, not because there was a fault in the mechanism, but because actually their quality of lives have not changed. So I will conclude now. And just to say, I hope that at least gives some thought about the challenges of remembering. And the final thought I wanted to leave with you comes very much from, that's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report from Chile called Nunca Más, Never Again. And you also see a photograph there of the skulls which are kept in one of the churches in Rwanda. And I have a quote there from 1845, where basically the idea is, if we hear and we see the pain of the past, that somehow that will change how we think about the present. And I'm reminded of a colleague in South Africa called Hugo van der Merwe, who used to say that in the South African Truth Commission, there always seemed to be two versions of how people thought people would change. And the one was seeing the light, and the other was feeling the heat. And so Archbishop Desmond Tutu and others believed that if we saw and heard the pain of people, that we would all change, that we would change our attitudes and how we thought about others. And then there were the lawyers and the human rights people who felt that only if we felt the heat would we change. If there were strict standards in society, if there were much stricter laws about racism and about how the police and others might behave in society. And it's only when we felt the heat that we would change. And I think this is a valuable way to think about remembering in conflict, because we need to be careful of not making very simple assumptions that if you hear people's pain, that it would lead to change. And one of the challenges there, and there's a writer called Peter Narvik who's written a lot about Holocaust museums, is he says one of the dangers is when we tell our stories is we over-identify with the victims. Not that there's a problem with identifying with the victims, but that sometimes when we over-identify with the victims, we fail to see that we all ourselves could, under certain circumstances, be perpetrators. and that we also all have a responsibility in how we address conflict. So it goes back to that idea that really to remember in conflict has to be a reflective process, a self-reflective process of remembering. And we need to not think about remembering in conflict in a very simplistic way. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. We've time for a couple of questions now, and then, if you will, Professor Hamber, we can return to the panel format. But I'm just curious, what do you think when you hear senior politicians in the UK saying, it's time to draw a line under this, draw a line in the sand, that returning and reflecting over our past is like an open wound and it prevents healing? Is that something that has traction with you, or do you believe that the stories have to be told for healing to begin?
It's a difficult question. I mean, the way that I first approach that question is always to say that drawing a line actually is a way of dealing with the past. It might not be the way that I would advocate, but it is a methodology for dealing with the past. Spain tried to do that after the Civil War, and it kept things under wraps for a number of decades. And now, decades later, they're digging up bodies again. And so they tried that methodology, and it didn't really work. There are other societies where that's been slightly different. A society like Mozambique, where actually people have disagreed a lot with how South Africa approached the past, and they felt that actually culturally not talking about the past was more valuable, because people often believed that the moment you started to talk about the past, you sort of unleashed these spirits into the present. But even in that society, we then started to see local and community ways in which people did start to tell their stories. So I think it is an attempt and a strategy to deal with the past. I don't think there's much evidence to suggest it ever really works. And my view would be, I don't think there's a miraculous way of dealing with the past. And I wouldn't want to be someone that says you have to simply just remember for the sake of remembering. But I think you can't avoid it. And you're better to be thinking about how can you do that in a systematic, integrated way. And what we know in Northern Ireland is there has been no systematic way of doing that. So for all the failings in South Africa, and I could talk about many of those, at least the politicians came together. They had disagreements, but they, as South Africans, put a process in place. So if that didn't work, it was our fault that it didn't work. But we didn't shy away from trying to do something in a collective way.
Is that the danger in politicians in Northern Ireland not grasping the nettle sooner? Does it become more difficult the longer time lapse there has been from the most potent period of the trauma, so to speak? Because you're constantly living with the danger that something's going to come up in conversation and trigger an outpouring at any time. Just when things are settled, something emerges. Or can it be better to let things settle and for a new generation to consider the past, even though they're a step removed from it?
And again, I wish there was an easy answer for that. But what I can reflect is that when I first came here in 1996, and I moved here 2001, and I started to work on these issues from 96, in the early part of the conflict, I heard lots of people saying, well, we can't deal with the past because it's too soon. And now people have let it ride for 20 years. And now I hear people saying, oh, it's too late to deal with the past. So what does that actually tell you? Well, what actually tells you is there is no perfect time for dealing with the past. And actually what it is a political and a social decision about whether you want to actually do it. Because I don't believe there actually is an ideal and a specific moment. Yes, arguably in South Africa, by doing it relatively close to the transition, when there was a political momentum, it probably made it a bit easier to do that. But if I go back to South Africa today, and when I speak to students over there are many who are saying, no, we need another Truth Commission now, because it didn't properly deal with the issues of race in the way that we would like it to have dealt with the issues of race. It dealt with political conflicts structured in a certain way of thinking about it during the apartheid time, or didn't deal with inequality questions. And so, unfortunately, and people don't like to hear this, that if it took you, and it depends on who you speak to, if it took you 50 years to get into this conflict, or some people are fond to remind me in pubs, 600 years to get into this conflict, it's going to take a very long time to work the process out over the long term. And that really requires a very steady form of leadership, rather than a leadership that continually tries to politicize that past in their favor.
Yeah, because you talked about the challenges in the South African context, but heavens, if we look at the current challenges here with Brexit, pandemics, this isn't the time, is it? We're looking at many more years before this can be tackled, aren't we?
I don't know. I mean, maybe that's a question we can throw up to the audience to have a discussion. You know, what's interesting, and I've been doing it over the years, collecting what people say as a reason why we should deal with the past and a reason why we shouldn't. And the problem is that generally the same reasons are given for both. So you will hear people saying, well, the reason, because we didn't deal with the past in Northern Ireland, what that has meant is that every bread and butter issue, let's say healthcare and COVID, becomes a political issue. Or, you know, so we didn't deal with the past, therefore everything remains politicized. And so not dealing with the past actually destabilizes the present. And then you will hear people say the exact opposite, that if we start to deal with this, it'll create a sense of destabilization, which will make it very hard for us to deal with the present. And so my view is very much, actually, what we really need is a much more principled discussion about, is it valuable to deal with the past? And if we say yes, then we need to find a way to do that. And that discussion has not really happened. I mean, it's happened to some degree with the Stormont House Agreement, but it's sort of one foot in, one foot out continually. Now, there are very specific challenges for Northern Ireland in that regard that are different to South Africa. So to, you know, put it very simply, political power here is much more evenly balanced. So people fear the past more than in South Africa, because in South Africa, it was clear where the moral majority globally sat. In terms of, you know, apartheid as a crime against humanity. So the African National Congress, Mandela's party, could engage in that process, knowing that whatever came out, even if they engaged fully, it was never going to completely tip the balance. Whereas here, you have both sides, or, you know, I wouldn't want to say there's just two sides, but the majority parties fearing that if anything comes out, it will tip the balance one way or another. So there are also structural reasons. But at the end of the day, I think it's a case of, do you grasp the nettle or not? Because I don't know if the timing is ever right.
We have a question in for you from Tony Kennedy. He says, reminiscence is not politically neutral. How do we deal with rewriting the past?
Yeah, and this is a question which, you know, for those working on these issues of memory and conflict, they struggle with all the time. And the sort of common view at the moment is that the only way you really deal with that is to actually accept the fact that the past is a contested space, and to find different ways in which those contested narratives can come in contact with each other. And so the past is actually a negotiation rather than something in which one narrative is going to triumph over the other narrative. And it's easy to say that. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to do that in practice. But there have been different attempts to do that, and you know, many of the, you know, Joe Berry mentioned some of the storytelling work that takes place. You know, work where it moves from the premise that people have different positions, and it's a contest. It's a contested, framed discussion about the past, rather than actually ever thinking that one narrative can win over the other. And so there are different ways of doing that, whether it's through you know, museums and memorials which can talk about you know, the story that they're telling is not the definitive case. It's something which actually is a process and will change over time, and they frame the narrative in that way, or whether it's that type of group and individual storytelling type of work.
Yeah, because I'm interested in this whole concept with winners and losers, and how you draw them into a more centrist position, and the fact that the government on occasion, it seems, to feed that notion of winners and losers with documentation that's open to interpretation. So nobody ever seems to take a stand for fear of offending another. We will discuss that in the panel session, but there's one point I want to raise with you just briefly, because we've got 2 more guests coming up, and then the panel session. Don't forget, send your questions in. The Q&A button, really, really easy, because these are great conversations we're having. One of our next guests is originally from South Africa, like yourself, Professor Hamber. I'm just curious about, aren't we always in Northern Ireland interested as to see how other people perceive us? How do you think society in Northern Ireland is different, if at all, from society in South Africa? And why do you think the truth and reconciliation model was more successful in South Africa than so far it has proven to be here?
That's a great question. The only way to answer that question is to sort of generalize, and so you get yourself into trouble for generalizing. But cultures are different, and people do engage in processes differently. And I'll be interested to see what my friend from South Africa says. But when I think of South African culture, it's quite an expressive culture. It's a culture which really puts things out there. We didn't need the rest of the world to talk about violence in South Africa. Actually, everybody in South Africa put it out there. And so it's a very expressive type of a culture. Whereas you only have to stand when we could do these things at the airport and watch, some person from Northern Ireland and their American relatives coming home, and them running up to them and throwing their arms around them, and them going as stiff as a board, because that's just not really how people generally behave. It's a much more closed culture. And in that regard, I think the idea of people publicly telling their stories in these very open public forums is probably a much more difficult concept for people to think about here than it might have been in South Africa. And I am speaking very generally here, of course, so forgive me for that. But how we engage and how we talk about things is important, and we could go into all different reasons as to why is the culture that way, but I don't fully see the idea of a sort of very big public process. The sort of sharing of pain collectively is something which would completely fly for people here. It doesn't mean there isn't a need for a process to hear those stories and a way to find to do that, but it would have to be something that sits comfortably with people.
Interesting to hear your thoughts. So stay with us. We've got time right through up to nearly midday today, but let's introduce our next 2 guests, if you don't mind. Thank you for now, Professor. Nandi Jolie has been active in the Northern Ireland arts community as a writer, an artist and a facilitator. She's been involved with the Irish Writers' Centre Cross Borders project and the Same Difference project and Poetry Jukebox. You're very, very welcome, Nandi. And along with Nandi today, we're joined by poet, lecturer and literary critic Sean Hewitt. Sean's debut collection, Tongues of Fire, was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year award. In 2019, he won an Eric Gregory Award, and he's also the winner of the Resurgence Prize 2017. His memoir, All Down Darkness Wide, will be published next year. So Sean, too, you are very, very welcome to today's symposium. Fascinating. Nandi, if I can begin with you, just to pick up from what we've been hearing from Professor Hamber there. Your life experience in South Africa, you came here as a student, having just completed university studies. How would you say the societies differ, and why do you think we're struggling to tell our stories here?
Thank you, Karen. Can I just say to Professor Molo Sawubona Kunjani? I really am going to try my best to answer that, but I think it's the way I look. And people that know me and people that have seen me, whether I'm performing or they're my neighbors, I am just the same person. As a professor was saying about the culture, I am Xhosa, and Xhosa people are known for loving to speak. Mandela Xhosa. So it's in us. So I am a talkative person. I remember when I first came here, I met a friend and made a great friendship with her. And she said to me, Nandi, just remember there's places you can't go to. And I was like, oh, that's intriguing. So tell me about these places I can't go to. So I went to all those places and I made sure sometimes when going to those places that I was wearing my traditional Xhosa outfits. And 20 years later, nothing has happened to me.
Oh, terrific. Well, Nandi, tell us what you want to talk to us about this morning. And then, of course, we'll come back with some questions after your presentation. Take it away for us.
Okay, so I'm just going to share 3 short poems with you. And the first one, I requested to share an image. So if you just bear with. So this is an image for the poem that I want to share. And this is a South African woman called Sarah Batman, known as Sarki Batman to others. And she's a Khoi woman who, due to the European objectification of her buttocks, was exhibited as a freak show attraction in the 19th century Europe under the title Hottentot Venus. She was born in 1775 and she died in Paris in 1850. And she was so exhibited that she was also in the Houses of Parliament in England and so forth. But one of the things that Nelson Mandela did when he became the president of South Africa was to make sure that he brought her body home so that she could be given a proper burial and the respect she finally deserved. But I think some of her body parts are still in museums in Europe, but most of her body was returned. So Sarah Batman. Enveloped in her bosoms, in the depth of sorrows, it speaks not. Secretly, it enters her wound, the only friend in eternity. And the next poem, I was so glad when a professor brought up the image of the peace walls. It's called Peace Walls, Belfast in brackets. You know, I growing up in South Africa. I was born in 1978. However, I didn't experience the past laws, so it didn't really affect me in you know, like for example, the Dom Pass, which was a domestic pass that was designed to segregate the population. It was to manage urbanization and allocate migrant labor, and it severely limited the movement of Black people who were currently moving from one homeland to the other. So these were kind of like passports. And we know that in South Africa, they had a curfew that after 9 o'clock, it was deemed illegal to be walking the streets. So peace walls. I come from tear gas, necklace, Dom Pass, mellow yellow, toy toy, kill the Boer, gaffer. We stood in defiance. We conquered. No peace walls there. And the last poem that I wanted to read was this dream when you come and you've left Africa, or South Africa, where I come from, and probably you're the first person to ever do that in your family, first person to ever own a passport, as I am in my family, first person to ever graduate in my family. And therefore, when you leave the land, the blessings that comes with that, but also the expectation that you are going to bring the wealth back. And I used to laugh at my mom. I tell her all the time, she still doesn't believe it, that I live in Northern Ireland, not in London. She tells people that I live in London. And I said, Mom, no, I live in Northern Ireland. She still does, because it's just a dream for your child to be living in London. And then they ask me things like, how often do you see the Queen? So I sometimes take on to that very well. And I said, actually, I see the Queen quite often, and me and her might have just a wave at each other. So sometimes it plays with that. But I think this expectation from people that we've left behind, that our lives here are so easy that we can send money home anytime when trouble, comes is just a myth. And the mental health impact as well of going through the process of being, a breadwinner, but also what happens then when the dream doesn't materialize, the mental health implications of that. But I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that it takes anything from 5 to 10 years to obtain citizenship, and it can be over £30,000, expensive. And whilst you are still going through all that process, you still have to live here, pay your rent and work and all those things. And people back home still expect us to send money. So this last poem is called Ink. The letter came today, 10 years late, but it arrived. Majestic and reverent, it addressed me by my first name with the title Miss and Dear. The letter came today, 10 years late, but it arrived. My dreams were on standby, holidays and places to visit marked, money boxes empty for now, but at least I can sleep tight. Because the letter came today, 10 years late, but it arrived, telling me that I am now a citizen. I will breathe the same air, walk the same streets of Belfast without fear, and roam Ireland like a bird. I am no longer a case number, a statistic. My anger will disappear. Fear will be the thing of the past. I must be grateful that the letter came today, 10 years late. I am not on the next charter plane from detention to deportation. I am here. Thank you.
Andy, wonderful. Really, really powerful words. And Sean, you're the wordsmith. Listening to all of that, congratulations on all of your published works. And I'm really looking forward to your next publication. But we were listening to the professor a little bit earlier. He was saying about how some people in this part of the world find it difficult to communicate, especially during a pandemic and at a time when we're trying to express ourselves and focus on relationships. How important do you think your type of writing is?
To myself or to everyone else? I don't know. I think it's important. I was interested listening to that reflection on memory and nostalgia and kind of functional nostalgia in some ways, or functional ways of remembering. And I think what is particularly useful about poetry is that it gives you kind of a structure to put the memory into, and it can be a way of it almost presents you with a puzzle to figure out the memory for yourself, and then that can be a very engaging way of thinking through the past, or setting things aside, or seeing how they link together and trying to unpack what is quite a complex situation. And I think in the pandemic and things like that, when people find it hard to verbalize some of the macro structures of the world, it can be good to have this small space to think through them on a personal level.
An anxious time for a lot of people, and as you say, that framework being provided and through poetry gives you that structure and that stability, I suppose, to formalize your thoughts. How have you used the period of the pandemic?
Probably not particularly productively. I've been writing a memoir, which is coming out next year. So most of my time has been doing that and teaching as well. Yeah, it's been, I suppose, a productive time, but I found that the isolation, which I thought would be a productive thing for a writer, is actually not particularly productive. I think often you forget that you need all of this interaction of things going on around you in order to spark something outside. It's kind of, otherwise you can sit very much in your head and feel like you don't have anything to put down. Sometimes you need someone to say a particular word or to tell you a story, and you think, okay, that's jogged a memory, or that's jogged something that pulls it out. So yeah, I'm hoping that over this year we've all been doing our own work in our heads and by the time things settle a bit again, it might be, we might be able to get it out. That's my hope anyway. Yeah.
So what do you think of when you think of Reminiscence, our theme today? Have you written some work that fits into that category, or is that something that you think perhaps now, with this period where we're thinking more about ourselves and what's going on in our heads, that this might be something for the future?
Well, yeah, it has been something I've been thinking about, particularly with the memoir and the poetry. I suppose, you know, a lot of that requires you to dive into your own memory and think, how do things fit together, or what significance is this memory to something. I think one of the things that the memoir deals with really is how might individual lives be affected by histories that we don't think we are living through ourselves. So how do the historic structures of, in my case, queer history, affect individual lives, and how might we kind of connect back to this idea of a family that's gone before us that we're not blood related to? Is there a way that they still kind of speak through us, or affect the way that we live our lives? And I think I've convinced myself the answer is yes. And the challenge is whether I will convince anyone else in the book to.
What convinced you then, Sean?
I think that there are ways in which we almost have instinctive reactions to the world around us that we're not conscious of acting out ourselves. I found it very interesting to think back and to talk to other people, the ways I thought before I came out, before I knew there were any other gay people in the world. It was strange to know that they were very similar to how other people thought, and the things that I did were very similar to what other people did. So even in that supposed isolation, I was acting in very similar ways to other people. So it made me think that there was perhaps this instinctive reaction that everyone is going through. And it's only when you reach that kind of communal conscious stage that you realize that perhaps you're acting out the results of history going on around you, and you're not fully conscious of it when you're doing it. So I think in that way, we are the products of history, even things that we ourselves are not living through. So I was thinking of growing up in the 90s, maybe the history of the AIDS crisis was in my parents' mind. So that affected the way I reacted to that situation, even though I wasn't at immediate risk of it because I was a child in the 90s. So all of these ways in which those things that go before us actually begin to change how we are, those transitional stages. Those are the things I've been thinking about.
Really, really interesting. And then when you've engaged with other people, they've had shared experience. You're telling us that it's not just a sense of your story. This is something that's a collective.
Well, I think I would wager that the risk of writing is always that you feel that you're putting down something very strange on the page, and you might be confessing something very bizarre about yourself. But in my experience, no matter what I have put down on the page, there's always been someone that said, that's me too. And I think in putting into words all these things that we might think are strange or isolating about ourselves, we actually realize that through literature, they're not actually strange to us at all. They're very common things. And I think that connection is really great. To know that you're not alone is a lovely thing, I think.
Sean, I know you've got some poems that you're going to share with us today, so we'd love to hear them.
Sure. So I was going to read 3 poems for you today. The first one is called St. John's Wort, which you may know as kind of this little yellow herb wildflower. The poem begins with an image. In some iconography, St. John is figured carrying his head on a plate, so that you can see that he's been beheaded. So it begins with that. St. John's wort. Named for a man who carries his own head on a platter, for a day when the sun bears its light over the land so slowly, so measuredly, that the night crouches back and waits. A token of love, of patience, of the will to lift the mind outside oneself and let it rest, let it heal. Alone, I remembered this little herb, the yellow spikes of the flower, frill of stamen, as something akin to happiness, its bright stars, its tiny play at hope, its way of lifting through the grass. And I brought it to you, a light to illumine the dark caves of your eyes. At the door of the ward, being searched, the nurse took from me my gathering of flowers. I found you on the bed, staring, still in shock. Bringing no gift, I took your head in my empty hands like a world and held it. The second poem is just called Evening Poem. I have a couple of them. I'm a lazy titler. And yeah, I don't think there's anything that you need to know about it. It was a moment, I think, in the book that deals with coming to terms with the more traumatic parts of the first section of the book and allows a moment of rest and reflection and perhaps reminiscence. Evening Poem. First, the clatter-iron blackbird, its fanatical shuddering in the magnolia. Dusk, and the garden is reassembling, calling its sparrows home. And what a voice racket under the aucuba, doors closing too, and each sparrow an iron filing sweeping the field lines of the garden. I sit out in the last warmth and watch it all come to rest. The light falling, the thrushes settling in the sycamores at the far end of the lawn. How each tree lowers itself under a new weight. And I hold out for a while, for everything to darken, for the birds to stop singing, as though I am teaching myself again to bear it. Now just read one last poem. It's called Ilex, which is the Latinate name for the holly tree family. I had to add a short epigraph to this poem because when I first sent it out anonymously to an editor, they were very surprised that I was a man. And then everyone thought it was my child that was breastfeeding in the poem. So I had to add an epigraph. So it's now Ilex after the birth of my nephew. Distracting myself, waiting for news. I walked until I saw this white cluster of holly growing at the base of a tree. The stems yellowed, the angled clutch of leaves like a bleached coral, a pale antler, almost medieval, like a relic unearthing in the gloom of the wood. Later, still the baby would not latch, and I came back to this holly, unhardened by the sun, unable to turn the light into strength. May it keep its whiteness. May it never learn the use of spikes. Or, in time, when a crown is made of it, may the people approach one by one to witness how a fragile thing is raised. Thank you very much.
John, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Well, let's bring all of our guests together for the next 10 minutes or so, and we can float around some of the ideas that have been raised throughout the morning. And I'm just curious, actually, Professor Hamber, listening to Nandi and listening to Sean, you move in a world of politicians, of documentation, of strategy. Do you think we make enough of the contribution that the world of art and literature could offer in reconciliation? Listening to contributions from people whose message is very concise and unambiguous and healing in the same way.
That's a great question, and I do think we don't use the arts and literature enough. I mean, it's not that people aren't doing that. I think it's not always recognized as a tool for dealing with the past. And so if I go back to what I was talking about the sort of the hidden stories, the micro stories, the complexity of stories, these are things which are much more suited to the arts than they are to the world of politics and facts. So Michael Ignatieff, writing about Truth Commission, says that the best they can do is narrow permissible lies. So in other words, they're an investigative tool which maybe creates some parameters about who did what to whom, and it gives us something to move forward, but it's just sort of a framework, really. And I think if we think of those more political mechanisms, I think that's all they can really do. But then that leaves all the ambivalent stuff around that, all the complexities of people who are in movements and out of movements, and all those stories that we know about conflict. And so anyway, the short answer is that absolutely, I think that it's much better suited to that ambivalent dialogue space of memory that I was talking about than some of those more official mechanisms.
They're almost too literal, and I see Joe is nodding, and I suppose, Joe, you're an example of a very, very powerful micro story, and you've managed to elevate your story to a broader audience than perhaps many others would. But you operate similarly in a world where it's not about right and wrong. It's not about victory and defeat. It's about understanding, and it's about empathy. So I'm just wondering, do you believe that empathy is something that can be taught, or that it can change mindsets in such a powerful way that it's something we need to rate higher?
Well, great question. Well, and it doesn't take a place from accountability that Brandon talked about. Like, accountability is, hugely important. And for me, empathy is a way we can be with each other, starting with our children. And there's amazing work going on in teaching empathy to little people, to primary and then secondary. And I think that is the way that we can bring in more a culture of empathy. And that involves things like emotional intelligence. It's all the people working in restorative schools. There's incredible work being done with young people at the moment. And I personally feel that young people have more capacity for empathy and a more emotional intelligence than my generation, and then the next generation probably have more. But we also need I would love our politicians also to demonstrate that their capacity for empathy. It's actually, just a quick example, 2 years from the appalling terror attack on the mosques in New Zealand. So I'm just feeling that very strongly. And the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, did such an amazing example of what empathy looks like on a political level at a time when it was so needed. And I think the fact she could speak for a different community other than her own and show that solidarity just sends out such a strong message, which is really inspiring.
Have you a view on what the people that you congregate with, the people who you share your story with, the people who are like-minded, what more they could do to publicize that movement that you represent? I'm thinking of someone like Gordon Wilson, for example, and the remarkable way he responded to the death of his daughter Mary in the Enniskillen bombing. There are people in our past, people like you, who have, for a moment or a period in time, made us all feel more human and more empathetic. You've done a very good job of maintaining a presence, but too often, as someone who would have been involved in the media, those stories come and they disappear again. What more could be done, do you think, to give that community, which is our community, greater prominence?
Well, maybe that's a question for the media, for those who are responsible for sending out the messages, and to look more for the amazing stories of people who are showing empathy, who are turning their pain, for the poetry, for the music, for all the amazing creativity that there is. And I know there's work. The work that's been done on grassroots in Northern Ireland is extraordinary, and the positive stories. And let's start sharing them, because it's very easy for us to feel outrage or feel the fear. And so we need ways to help us feel inspired and positive. And then when we're feeling inspired, we're more likely then to reach out and ourselves be positive change makers.
Nandi, you're clearly a positive change maker. You make it your business to make us smile and to be upbeat. What would you take away from listening to Jo today, for example?
I think Jo is absolutely amazing. And honestly, all respect to her. But I mean, this is all I do. I create from what I hear. And because now I've lived in Northern Ireland, and in the next coming years, I would have lived in Northern Ireland longer than I would have lived in South Africa, and therefore my writing has to reflect that. And I've just starting today, we're starting rehearsals of my play, which is called Partition, which is talking about the partition of Northern Ireland, not anything about South Africa. So I mean, I have written plays about what I hear and what I think I'm hearing, because those are two different things as well, what I hear and what I think I'm hearing. And for me, the way to process it is sometimes is to maybe put it on a play or on a poem or do a storytelling session. But most of my work, before I even published plays and poetry, was to go into schools. And I was a cultural ambassador for good 10 years. And what I was talking about is then what we did have in common, and what we did have, maybe what we didn't have. For example, I like to use the analogy of looking at the time and asking the pupils, what time do you think it is in South Africa right now? Just to have, for them to have that concept that time, is not the same, and how we look at things could not be the same. But also, I don't know about you, but I miss a lot of home, and home's home. And I always say to people when I'm talking to them, today in South Africa it's 44 degrees. And I think that's just sometimes people don't realize that there are places on earth that are different, and therefore things happen differently in some places. It's just sometimes, maybe interrupting a thought or interrupting a sentence, or just throw something in that, like I would like to say, a spanner in the works.
Here, I've got some more comments coming through. Richard Sloan's been in touch. Thank you, Richard. He says, thank you, Nandi. Your story and the poem about the letter were very informative. And he says, wonderful. Anne Anderson, she says, totally agree with the focus on teaching empathy and compassion in our schools. Children in Crossire, Crossire, forgive me, I'm not quite sure where that is, have developed a set of lessons on teaching compassion, which some schools have got involved in, and awards granted are bronze, silver and gold for compassion as an incentive to engage in the process. Not that we need a certificate to be encouraged to teach empathy, such an important quality for our young people on a local and global level, says Anne. Crossfire, apologies, she's corrected that for me. Thank you for that, Anne. I'm just curious, too, Professor, coming back to you and a point you raised earlier about truth and reconciliation. Why do you think it was women in particular who wanted to engage? And should we be surprised that what they wanted to talk about most was the most painful thing that had happened to their family, that the trauma of the violation of their family?
Well, I don't want to speak on behalf of all the women who presented at the Truth Commission, but yes, of course. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that people wanted to tell their stories and what had happened to them. But the point I was trying to make was that, and maybe it goes back to the question of art and literature and what we do and how we close and open spaces, that space that we created, although it was an open space where people could tell their stories, there was a piece of legislation that said you could tell a story about murder, attempted murder, abduction, disappearance, or severe ill treatment. So it already narrowed what it is that you could tell your story about. So yes, of course, it was valuable. And there are many examples of people finding that as a valuable experience to share that pain, as you mentioned. But my point was that through creating those mechanisms, we also create boundaries. And I heard other cases, I remember a case, this was actually of a man, but I remember him saying he wanted to tell the story of the torture that happened to a friend of his. And the commissioners just closed him down. They were just saying, no, we have to hear your story, because on the paper it was about your story and not about this other secondary story. And so that was really my point about when we're thinking of remembering and reminiscence, and then when we put it into these official processes, how do we open and how do we close spaces?
Is it interesting to you that it was the women who were, in a sense, the spectators of the event, rather than the person who was abducted or the person who was imprisoned, who wanted to tell the story? It was the witnesses to the event, the spectators, the bystanders, those who perhaps felt most helpless, who were most traumatized, rather than the people who had been taken away from their families.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear from the others about this idea also of, who tells stories and who doesn't. I mean, what we know about trauma is that sometimes it can manifest in all sorts of different ways. So one of the things we found in the South African Truth Commission, for example, was that actually some of the people who process the data experience more of a traumatic reaction than those who actually met the victims. Because when you met the victim and you took the story from them, there was a human interaction, or Joe said there was empathy, maybe you saw them leave with a family member, whereas the person processing the data was just sitting there typing in case after case after case. So they had no real context for that. Or if you think of the translators of that process, who were then translating the multiple languages of South Africa in the first person. So they were saying, this happened to me, this happened to me. I was tortured, even though it wasn't them, but obviously they had to translate it in the first person. And so maybe I'm diverting a bit from your question, but how that trauma of the past manifests is very contextual, and it depends on what's going on around you.
Interesting. And Joe, does that tie in with your sentiment that in engaging with Patrick Magee, you were healing yourself, but perhaps other people, even family members who chose not to adopt that path, have a different experience and are perhaps holding on to the pain longer than you have managed to?
At first, I want to say I need to see Nandi's play. It just sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And so I can't wait. I just know that it's going to be really, really powerful, and we'll start a different conversation, which is what we need always. And play's got an amazing way of doing that. So thank you, Nandi. That sounds incredible. So yes, looking at women peace builders in the world, of which there are many, there are less women involved in the actual creating the peace processes. It tends to be still very male dominated. I'm sure Brandon will tell me if I'm wrong in this. And yet it is the women who are doing the active peace building work around the world. So I'd like to see a lot more women involved in a leadership level. And I think that's a change that's going to happen. In terms of my own family, I can't measure that. We all have our own way of responding. And I took on the wound of the whole conflict. I don't know why. I didn't have to. I could have breathed for my dad, and that would have been that. But for me, my healing was completely bound up with the healing of these islands. Now we're all different, and we all have our own ways. And what's important is that everyone gets the right support and help. And we have so much understanding of trauma now. And one of the things I'm doing, like I said earlier on, is trying to change how the British government gives support for victims of terrorism. And actually, probably not surprised, but there are other countries that sort of do it better. And like the French model is extraordinary. What happens if someone's affected by terrorism there compared to how we are in the UK. So there's lots that we can learn to make sure that people don't develop complex PTSD. And some people may always go on to that because of what they've already experienced, but some people won't if they get the right kind of help. And that's not a 6-week counselling. That's not going to hit it. It's got to be specifically sort of trauma aware and at the right time as well. So that's one of the things I'm passionate about changing.
Yeah. Well, you're a very passionate woman about so many elements to do with conflict resolution and peace building. And I think if this morning has helped anybody in any sense, is to show that there are a tremendous array of approaches and options and outlets to help all of us manage how we see the past and how we fit into it. And perhaps in some sense that too will also project things forward. But I'm afraid we are out of time. It has been an absolute pleasure to meet all of you. I'm sorry we don't have more time. Thank you very, very much indeed to Joe and to Brendan and to Sean and to Nandi. Great people, a wonderful session, and well done to Vincent too and the team at Marketplace and Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Council. Great initiative, lovely to be part of it. Have a great day, whatever you're up to, and thanks again. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you.
Bye.